True reconciliation is never cheap, for it is based on forgiveness, which is costly. Forgiveness, in turn, depends on repentance, which has to be based on an acknowledgement of what was done wrong, and therefore on disclosure of the truth. You cannot forgive what you do not know. This is a quote from a statement made in 1995 by the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu on his appointment to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Greetings, friends. Welcome to this webinar conversation on Forgotten Tragedies, Remembering the Past and Moving Towards Reconciliation. This webinar is the wrap-up of a series of regional virtual conversations that the Commission of Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches organized last year in 2021 as part of a series of activities marking the Commission's 75th anniversary and focusing on past events that have mutilated both bodies and souls. The first webinar of the series last year coincided with the day of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma, USA, a tragedy during which the prosperous Black neighborhood of Greenwood was completely burned down during 18 hours by a white mob. During that webinar, we also remembered, among other tragic events, the Zong Massacre, a tragic event which involved the mass killing of more than 130 African enslaved people who were overthrown overboard during several days by the crew of the British slave ship Zong in November 1781, when the ship ran low on drinking water following navigational mistakes. These regional webinars last year showed us that all regions have unspoken and forgotten wounds from the past, and that truth-telling is about finding closure, about finding the space for proper mourning. Unless the hurt is acknowledged and remembered, dealt with properly and healed, trauma is intergenerational. Now, keeping in mind the new World Council of Churches pilgrimage on justice, reconciliation, and unity, Commission of Churches on International Affairs offers today this webinar during which our panelists will explore further issues of acknowledging past wrongs, forgiveness, healing of memories, reconciliation, memorialization, and reparations. Today's webinar will be moderated by Reverend Dr. Peter Kruschle. He is the incoming director of the WCC Commission for World Mission and Evangelism. He's a mission theologian who has been working especially on the legacies of slavery and colonialization in mission societies. He is also a pastor from the United Reformed Church in the UK. As in previous webinars of this series, my colleague Reverend Dr. Mikey Roberts will be co-facilitating this conversation. He is the WCC Program Executive for Spiritual Life and Faith and Order and coordinates the daily prayers at the Ecumenical Center. He also gives leadership to the musical and spiritual life of WCC initiatives. He's from Antigua and he's ordained within the Moravian Church, Eastern West Indies province. Without further delay, please lead us in this conversation.
Greetings, friends. Thank you, Segma, for that introduction and for this invitation to sit in the midst of this conversation. I'm keen to enable the conversation, but I'm also well aware I represent movements and people who are deeply implicated in this conversation, and I'm ready to address that if at any point people need that. We have become aware of the particular role Christianity and mission especially has played in colonization. We're also aware of the part and contribution that Christianity has made, particularly from the Global South, in the struggles for decolonization. The question comes then, what is our faith going to contribute to questions of repentance and reparation, and through that open a way that particularly represents our faith calling, that will open a way then for this pilgrimage towards reconciliation. So it is a delight to be amongst this group of speakers, commentators, and activists who will challenge us, provoke us, and inspire us, I'm sure. And Mikey is going to share a little bit on those who are present with us today before I introduce a further speaker. Mikey.
Thank you so much, Peter, and greetings to all. We are delighted to have you join in with us today, those who are participating, those who are sharing, those who will be leading, and those who will share with us in a more intentional way. Included among these, permit me to first introduce to you one who will offer us a video presentation, and that includes Professor Fabian Salvioli. He is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and the guarantees of non-recurrence. He's a human rights lawyer and a professor, and has a PhD on judicial sciences and a master's degree on international relations. We will hear later from Professor Fabian, and he is also a member of the UN Human Rights Committee. He served on that position between 2009 and 2016. And of course, I will just stop there for now. Later on segment, we'll include in the chat more details on Professor Fabian. Secondly, we also have with us today Sandiswa Lerato Kobi. I hope I have done justice to that, Sandiswa. And she is, of course, a lecturer in missiology in the Department of Christian Spirituality, Church History, and Missiology at the University of South Africa, UNISA, in South Africa. She holds a master's degree in theology from the University of Western Cape, South Africa, and we can say that it was a master's dissertation, which is entitled The Relationship Between Remorse and Offering Forgiveness, Selected Case Studies from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, that propelled her to do more work, and so she is now a PhD candidate. And her PhD project, she focuses more on the same issue of forgiveness, Ubuntu, and justice. Her doctoral research topic is entitled Between Ubuntu and Forgiveness, a critical analysis of Desmond Tutu's theology of forgiveness. And she's currently enrolled at the University of Pretoria and the VU University in Amsterdam. All the best with the rest of your doctoral project. You never ask a PhD student, how is the studies coming? That's a sinful question. So we will not ask that today. Good, but good to have you with us. And then we also have with us Martha Pedoniquotte. Now, I hope I got that correct. She's smiling, so that's a good thing. And she is a member of the Community Capacity Development Coordinator. She's the Community Capacity Development Coordinator for Ontario, Quebec. So first of all, we want to thank you for waking up this early and joining us from Canada. So thank you so much for that. Within the Indigenous Ministries and Justice Unit of the United Church of Canada. She's from the Ojibwe Potawatomi community of the Chippewa of the Nawash, formerly known as the Cape Croquet. And of course, this is in the peninsula in that Quebec, Ontario area. She's a mother and a grandmother and has a registered foster home, having cared for numerous First Nation children over the past 20 years. She serves currently the United Church of Canada in a volunteer capacity with the Aboriginal Ministries Council, and she also works as a victim support service coordinator and a policy program advisor for the Independent First Nations. So welcome, Martha, and we look forward to hearing from you later as well. And the final person who's present with us this morning belongs to a very wonderful esteem of former WCC staff. And it's a pity, Dr. Conrad, you were not with us because we had our Advent celebration last week. And so we welcome our retired staff who were very much present with us in the Ecumenical Center, but I'm sure you were with us in spirit. The Reverend Dr. Conrad Weiser is, of course, the former General Secretary here at the WCC. And he was in that office from 1993 until 2003. Before then, though, he was studied at Harvard University in the US, where he would have done studies in sociology and social psychology. And then back in Germany, where he's from, he worked from 1967 to 1969 as a university assistant in the practical theology at the Protestant Theological Faculty in Tübingen, where he earned his doctorate in theology. Of course, he would have joined the WCC back in the 1990s and then served as a general secretary. And in 1992, the Central Committee elected him as a general secretary for a 5-year term. And in September 1996, he was re-elected for a second term. And thereafter, he retired. The wonderful, wonderful season in life called retirement took place in 2004. And he lives in Berlin, Germany. And he and his wife have 4 grown sons. So we are very happy to have the Reverend Dr. Conrad Weiser with us today. Back over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Mikey, so much. We decided as we were planning our webinar today that we would begin, in fact, with a video input from Mr. Fabian Salvioli as a kind of scene setting for us all. And so our video will set out some key aspects as how he sees things, obviously as the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, which will give us a framing that our individual speakers will begin to address, as well as then go on to take us further into their own particular context and wisdom on all these issues. So first, we will watch the video, please.
It is my great pleasure to participate in this meeting organized by the World Council of Churches. And of course, I would like to provide the opportunity to pay tribute to the work done by the World Council of Churches in the last decades dedicated to the human rights issues. I am a special rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrences of the United Nations. And since the creation of the mandate in 2011, it is clear that a transitional justice process must be placed in human rights, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. That is the framework, the treaties obligations, and the standards established. But many voices from governments and other stakeholders try always to avoid the human rights obligations and imposing the idea that transitional justice is just political willness. That is devastating for victims. One of my lines of speeches says truth, justice, or reparations, guarantees of non-recurrences and memorialization processes are not options but legal obligations clearly established in the international human rights law. For that, I dedicated the report presented to the Council in 2020 to memorialization processes and last year on accountability issues. The international organs must have a single voice for a transitional justice processes and must be the human rights voice. That means centered victims approach. We have 5 pillars. The first one is truth. We need truth commissions, well integrated, with enough human and material resources, with an interdisciplinary staff focused in sensitive issues like gender-based violations. I presented a report in 2020, and with enough time for the job. In terms of justice, real accountability. I'm very concerned with the intentions of backlog. It was a great step, the adoption of the Rome Statute, but we can't go back and destroy the Nuremberg legacy. Amnesties are not valid, and we need to hold accountable and to prosecute and punish the most serious crimes and the responsibles of that crimes. The perpetrators and the complices. In terms of reparations, the concept is full reparation. That means restitution of the rights, rehabilitations when we had serious human rights violations like torture, disappearances, etc., for not just for the victims but also for the families. Satisfaction, that means apologies and other measures, and warranties of non-repetitions. We need to reform the structures that perpetrated the violence, especially armed forces, policies, security sector, and other places of the administration. Vetting process is also fundamental. The judiciary is sometimes a problem, and memorialization processes, the voice of the victims in the memory programs, and of course never ever to legitimate the speeches of the perpetrator. These 5 pillars must be fulfilled. If the states try to avoid one of these pillars, the process will not be successful. That is the example in many countries around the world. So for these massacres, serious human rights violations committed in the past, the approach must be holistic, fulfilling all these areas. Reparation is not just compensation, it's compensation plus the other measures. Justice is not just seeking the truth, it's also to prosecute and punish responsibles. Truth commissions must have a broad mandate and with enough resources. The warranties of non-repetitions are fundamental, if not the structure of violence continues, and memorialization for the current and next generations, all with the victim-centered approach. Thank you very much, and good luck in the continuation of this event.
So friends, I want to come to our panelists who are here amongst us to explore a little further some of the issues that Mr. Salvioli was raising. So Martha Pedoniquotte, I wanted to come to you first. In that outline we've been given of a kind of the process of transitional justice for remembrance, reparation and reconciliation, is there anything you would particularly want to either highlight or problematize out of that initial presentation? Martha, you need to unmute if you're ready to share. Oh, can you you need to unmute, Martha, sorry, we cannot hear you.
Okay, there we go.
Now we hear you. Martha, thank you. Over to you, sorry.
We must have pressed the button at the same time because I did unmute it. I just wanted to say that in response to that the United Church adopted, first of all, thank you for the introduction. My name is Martha Pedoniquotte, and my granddaughter says our name as Put On a Coat. That's how she pronounces it. So it's easier to remember. So Put On a Coat. My current position is with the National Indigenous Council, the Indigenous Ministries and Justice Unit of the United Church of Canada, as a Community Capacity Development Coordinator. And I work with the Ontario, Quebec, and Eastern region of Canada. And it's a pleasure to be asked to participate in this webinar. So one thing that I want to highlight as important to me is that the United Church adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they reported how their policies in reference to their Indigenous members in Canada reflect this. They noted that the Church's obligation to ensure policies, practices, and programs align with the principles, norms, and standards of the Declaration. And as the Church implements this framework for reconciliation and commits to developing mechanisms to report on its progress, the Indigenous faith communities have to be allowed to exercise a process that is based truly on Indigenous self-determination and self-government and possess a sustainable land-based support. The United Church acknowledged and apologized for its colonial application of the policy of assimilation and acknowledged its failure in the rejection of an Indigenous understanding of spirituality. So meaning that our own original spirituality was taken from us. And prior to the apology, British Columbia elder, the late Alberta Bailey, said that we have our own way of doing things. Other elders have said the same thing, especially when there was a conflict with the expectations of the broader Western Church. This is where colonial policies and procedures have worked against the Indigenous communities. And our elders have said that we need our own churches, our own leaders, and our own training programs and support systems. This means that we must establish and maintain a respectful relationship while maintaining our own autonomy, which is very important. And we will decide for ourselves who we are, who constitutes our ministries. And colonialism took our community control away from us and placed us in a colonial state of authority. So recovery from colonialism is our path moving forward, and the Indigenous Church will be an instrument of healing our identity and a place of renewal of our culture. So the pillars that was talked about is something that we look forward to, and it aligns with our 7 grandfather teachings of truth, respect, humility, love, and understanding. So thank you.
Thank you, Martha. This is also important, I think, in the context of hearing a voice from the UN, which sounds like there's a universal principle and process for this, to actually be reminded that this process of recovery, as you could describe it, from colonization, needs actually to be shaped acutely and responsibly to the context of the people, the history, the issues, and the culture people are wanting to reassert. So that, thank you for that. I'm very mindful of that. So Professor Kobe, could we come to you perhaps to, again, also just as Mr. Tharbioli has set the scene, but there's anything you want out of that particular contribution to either highlight or problematize from your context? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Lerato Kobe, but I just want to jump into it, and I'll say, well, as I listened to the speech and I thought to myself, well, in South Africa, perhaps we need a second commission, because the commission that we had, actually, in the words of Mamdani, it dealt with retaliation. So the biggest critique of the TRC was that it didn't deal with the crime against humanity, which was apartheid. The misplacement of people, all those things that were committed by the apartheid government to Black people in South Africa. But instead it dealt with the crimes committed when Black people retaliated against the system, which making Black people mostly the perpetrators at the Truth Commission of South Africa. Meaning that we have not even touched colonialism, let alone apartheid. We have not dealt with that. And this is why, in fact, currently I'm finishing a module now on truth commissions, because I was teaching a module on anti-racism, reconciliation, and in Christian faith. But students, many of the students reacted after some time negatively to this, because it was focusing on the need for victims to forgive. So with all that has happened in South Africa, and we call the new generation the fallis generation, because they've fallen off the set up standards of 1994, set up by Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. So we always say that this starts with the protest for service delivery in the townships. And I don't know if we've seen the Marikana massacre in 2012, where mine workers, in South Africa, I think it's the country where mine workers who worked in such a risk situation are paid even less than someone will come and help you clean your house. And in 2015, we started also seeing the fees must fall students, roads must fall students protesting for equality of education, and also decolonizing the country, the curriculum, everything, because also the story of post-1994 continued in the same line during apartheid. And people, what they don't know, as I was listening to the speech from Prof, I was thinking, what the world doesn't know is that since the 1913 Land Act, Black people were forbidden from owning land. And they had somehow 30% of land in their possession. And then under the apartheid government, it went to 7%. Now in the new democratic South Africa, it's 3%. And therefore it speaks about how we need to revisit what we mean by truth reconciliation in South Africa. So I just wanted to touch on that for now. Thank you.
This is startling, Professor Kobe. Thank you so much too. And let us then, be reminded this cannot just be a once and only moment. Then, as you say, this is an ongoing relationship of repentance, reparation, and rebuilding. And to see then that we are not dealing with a generation, we are dealing with a system. And that system keeps, replicating itself and reshaping itself and reasserting itself. So we may think, in one sense, we have invited you as a product of, a truth and reconciliation process that the world may have thought has gone well and has delivered, but actually exactly this caution. So I'm going to move now to our next guest, Reverend Dr. Conrad Reiser, just to begin to perhaps bring out some dimensions of the speech we heard and comments, and what are the implications that you see for the work of faith communities? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. My first reaction is to the introduction by Professor Salvioli, which of course is a very impressive and comprehensive presentation of all the legal context in the defense of human rights. And I think it must be the framework within which we deal with the issues. On the other hand, in listening to the two speakers before me, I realize how difficult it is when you continue to think in the terms of victim and perpetrator. Identify the perpetrators and identify the victims, and then try to handle the issue on this level. When we are dealing with systemic violations of human rights, where the individual accountability of perpetrators is much more difficult to determine, where you have lots of people who are involved in the violations of human rights without being identified or identifiable as individual perpetrators. You cannot continue to act in the same manner following the legal process. I was thinking back on a conversation I had in Uganda at the time of the Lord's Resistance Army, and the question how to respond to the challenge to the entire community in Uganda. And I was talking to with the Archbishop in the northern Uganda, who was involved in the process of community reconciliation. And he said to me, you know, our most important task in this context, reflecting on the massive violation of human rights, our most important task is to rebuild the community and to find a way of justice that recognizes, of course, the massive violations and the massive violence that has been perpetrated, but at the same time that restores the vital links within the community. And I think this is a dimension that faith communities must try to bring to the process. It is also a temptation. And the temptation was dealt with in the Kairos document from South Africa in identifying church theology that tries to focus on reconciliation too quickly without facing up to the issues of justice. But at the same time, when you make justice the core of the prophetic approach, then you seem to end up in trying to bring the perpetrators to court, make them accountable, emphasize reparations, etc., and forget about the restoring of the vital links of the community. And the community has to continue to live even with those who have been the perpetrators. So I think the challenge to the faith communities, and it's a challenge that the World Council has been trying to face in with regard to Rwanda, with regard to Colombia, with regard to South Korea after the Gwangju massacre, etc. The challenge is to so articulate the concern for justice that it includes this dimension of restoring the life of the community that has been, as a community, the victim of violation of human rights, not only individual, but the community. And I think here is the most important challenge to faith communities. And I think the World Council of Churches has tried to respond to this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Reiser. I'm sure these are themes that we're going to further explore. It's a challenge to the World Council of Churches, I think, especially now in our pilgrimage mode of working, to address how do we not just walk alongside victims, but how do we confront perpetrators? And I think this is an important part of our thinking, and anything you as panelists might have to share on that, I think will be helpful for the ongoing life of the WCC and the work we seek to do. But I want to come back now for a brief time for each of you to begin to expand maybe some of the comments you've shared. And Professor Lerato, you're already indicating your critique of the Truth and Reconciliation process. So please take some time now, maybe just to expand some of those thoughts as our conversation develops.
Thank you so much. Well, I think part of it for me, as I experienced working on this work, and also just work on also Desmond Tutu, who was really part of this process. I don't know whether when I read his work that actually, because there was this time where there was so much violence in South Africa towards the end of apartheid, there was so much violence that he himself had to focus on this reconciliation, just to stop the violence spilling over into a civil war. And of course, the new generation always critiques this by saying, but in the Black communities, war has continued because townships in South Africa, more than 50 people died every day. So that is a war zone already. So, but also, as I'm reflecting also on the importance of the work of truth commissions, and how do we also deal with this within the academia, and I think that perhaps for me already, I've already signaled that perhaps in South Africa we need a second truth commission, and perhaps truth commissions must shift the more focus on, while we know victims need to hear also the truth about their stories, but what about we shift also the Truth Commission and it focuses on perpetrators, how they want and need to be part of this community, and making symbols that actually, for example, in South Africa, I would think that for Black people today, that's what they need, because the way things have been going on, it's in fact is a repetition of history, because it was not just in 1994 when we had a time like that, even if it was not called Truth Commissions, but the black people helped in the Anglo-Boer War. After the frontier wars, many of our ancestors were massacred in those stories that people don't know and they never talked about. So they believed that, oh, South Africa will change again, but then the Land Act came in 1913. So it's always again, then there's violence. And then we say, oh, you know, people must come together against this violence. But then we still then continue in the same narrative. And I think Professor Pedoniquotte Maluleke has made that clear in his work, how we have continued in this line. So this is why, as I'm also trying to think through with my students, then how about the focus? Because in context of gross human rights violation, the focus is always the victim, but it's never the perpetrator made to account, to take responsibility. To such an extent in South Africa today, one of my friends coming from the Dutch Reformed Church said to me, you know, this thing is that, Lerato, when you talk about Truth Commission and you talk about forgiveness, and I'm coming from the Dutch Reformed Church, when you say forgiveness, you're forgiven, for me, it actually means that you have wiped my sins out. There's nothing that I need to do, because that's how I understand within theology. Now, you can't come back to me and tell me I need to do reparation, compensation, and that is people don't understand that, because now you find white South Africans in South Africa, they say, but Mandela and Desmond Tutu said forgive. So it doesn't balance to such an extent, even though Desmond Tutu in all of his books, he writes about the need for reparation and restitution. That conversation is not had because of the kind of theologies also we come from. So for me, my proposal is, in fact, how about we looked at it, even when we talk about communities, also communities differs because, for example, in the context of South Africa, the encounter with, although the church at some point resistance movement emerged from it, but the encounter with the missionaries and the indigenous people was never a peaceful one. So the new generation again will always say, but what is the restoration of society that we are talking about? So therefore, instead of going back to something that never existed, there was never a time of reconciliation. How about we talk about a time where we say we are committing all of us, perpetrators, victims, into this society, and we make our standpoints clear, our privileges, and what we are willing to give for the union and restoration of this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kobe. I hear in this a caution and a challenge, and exposing, particularly for white communities, but for perpetrating communities who suddenly find the language of reconciliation convenient in order to protect their interests, especially perpetrators who come, as it were, as minority communities and therefore feel there is this needs to now be operated so that we can maintain positions of authority and power, wealth, privilege, and influence. So I think that's, again, a very timely caution for faith communities using languages of reconciliation and what actually may be being done there, which is, of course, to silence opposition and that just claim for restitution. So I want to come now to you, Martha Pedoniquotte, if we could, to explore this perhaps some from your particular context. We, perhaps in the rest of the world, particularly seen in the recent revelations of the residential school murders, the reminder that violence is structural, institutional, and personal, and played out over generations. And you as a community have been living with this for so long. Would you be willing to perhaps outline who needs to repent and repair, and what that reparation would need to look like in your context?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. So just a little bit of context. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission developed 94 calls to action, and numbers 72 to 76 were established to uncover the truth about residential schools and to guide and inspire a national healing and reconciliation process. This has also been embraced by the United Church. So from the 1870s to the 1990s, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children in Canada were forcibly taken from their families, and they were housed in what the government referred to as Indian residential schools. So just lately, the discovery of tens of thousands of unmarked graves of Indigenous children who died or were murdered at these schools speaks to the torturous and tormented lives our children had to endure. There was 139 schools in Canada, and only a handful of those have actually discovered the bodies. They're still doing research, and certainly in my area, the schools have not even been looked at yet. So although there's tens of thousands of children found, there's going to be more that are found. So this is a legacy of the Indian residential school and the system and the institution, and the result of absolute oppression, and is a responsibility of the government, the Canadian government, to bear. The lasting and negative impact on Indigenous individuals, our families and communities today, are cumulative effects and have intergenerational consequences, which leave a legacy of pain, grief, hurt, and trauma. And this continues to marginalize our Indigenous communities and are a shameful reminder of this systemic racism, discrimination, and injustice that Indigenous peoples have faced and continue to face in this country. Canada's Prime Minister has publicly stated that there is no relationship more important to Canada than the Crown Indigenous relationship. And we need more than words and promises. We need concrete action that rights the wrongs through reparation, which includes upholding the rule of law. Why wasn't there a full and effective investigation of how these children died or of how their bodies were disposed of? These children need to be identified, returned, and reburied in a culturally sensitive manner. Canada also needs to provide a historical commemoration at the site, support residential school survivors, and also atone for its genocide of Indigenous people by the return of land, recognize treaty rights, and adopt a long-term plan to implement the calls to action under the TRC, and not just the 8 of the 76 the government is responsible to, but all of them. True reconciliation is not just a nice, I'm sorry, let's move on. It's actions and involves giving the land back to allow Indigenous people to care for their territories when our people are thriving and when we are living in our cultures and proudly sharing who we are and thriving in our own economies alongside the settler populations to live together peacefully, side by side, thriving and growing and utilizing the land and the resources equitably, then we will have reached true reconciliation and reparation. Miigwech.
Thank you again so much, Martha. These are clear sounding words, but they speak from the midst of pain and injustice. So we wish to also honor that and respect the spirit in which you come and speak to us and share that challenge. Reverend Dr. Reiser, we're returning to in a sense, some of the themes you were highlighting in your initial response around dealing with perpetrators. Now, I framed this question to you as a British subject, as my passport will say, with a German wife. And mindful of how Germany has sought to confront its recent history. And so I wanted to ask you whether you, might want to reflect on any of that in living in the city that you do, and how that is shown in very many different ways. But actually to push that challenge back to my nation, which also loves its history and presents its history as if we were a nation of abolitionists, you know, and liberals from the start. So I wonder, in this context of addressing questions of reparation, of addressing the perpetrator, addressing our history, perhaps what you might share from your context as a German in this context of Europe.
Thank you very much for this invitation, which is it's a difficult challenge. You refer to the fact that I live in Berlin. Berlin is full of memorial monuments of the Holocaust, of the fate of Roma and Sinti people, of the fate of homosexuals, and so on. And it seems to suggest that Germany is really actively involved in recollection of its burdened past. But this is a very complex process which has started late and has always needed certain impulses, sometimes from outside, to get going. I refer to the fact that the memory of the Holocaust and the German responsibility in this regard, with regard to the intended annihilation of European Jewry, has really come into public awareness and consciousness only through the Auschwitz trial in 1963-65. The first 10 years, it was almost absent, and the defensive mood among the German population with regard to the past was predominant. The full scope, and another example is the question of relationships with the Eastern neighbors who were the primary victims of German aggression and occupation, in particular Poland, and later on Russia. And here a memorandum issued by the German Protestant Church, together with the exchange of letters between the bishops' conferences in Poland and in Germany, brought into focus the need to acknowledge German responsibility with regard to the destruction brought to Poland. But at the same time, in this context, the question of reconciliation, not only as a spiritual, but also as a political task, was first articulated in public debate. Of course, one of the ways in which the question of coming to terms with the past has been raised by the younger generation in the student unrest in the 1968 following. It was the young generation who asked their parents about their role in the war and with regard to the violence against the Jewish population. And it was in these discussions, solid historical research that had been done by that time helped to articulate the particular responsibility of the German army and armed forces. It later served as the conceptual framework for a public exhibition on the role of the German army, which was the spark of a very, very widespread discussion. A final facet of this ongoing process of memory or commemoration of the burdened past was in fact due to German division and separation, the two German states, and the continuous search for ways of ending this separation and re-establishing the unity of the country and of the people. For instance, the annual commemoration of the upheaval in East Germany, in particular in East Berlin, on the 17th of June, 1953, which was commemorated every year. And in fact, for a long time, it was the national holiday. That served as a spark to continually reflect about the past and about the violation of the critical assessment of the German identity. The public discussions around the Helsinki process and the broken unity of Europe, and finally the famous address by the then federal president of the Federal Republic, Richard von Weizsäcker, on the 8th of May, 1985, 40 years after the end of the war. These all served to keep alive the need to come to terms with the burdened past. It is now only that from Polish neighbors, from Greece, from Italy, the question of reparation is again brought into public awareness. And it is only now that a new generation, third generation after the war, is also opening the issue of the colonial past of Germany. And that links up with the initial questions that you articulated. Of course, the new debate about racism, about post-colonialism, brings back another facet of the past. And we are far from having reached a state of reconciliation within the community and with our neighbors that have been the victims of German political and military action.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raisa, for this reminder, which I find always very moving, actually, the context of traveling in Germany. This determined history telling and truth telling that needs to go together, and this work that needs to be done. And I frame this question as a subject of His Majesty, King Charles III, as a British person, steeped in a global history of occupation and white violence in so many facets and forms. So as a piece of work that needs to be done, and noticing again the political control that is being exerted over history telling in the UK, that would prevent us confronting the kind of issues that Martha and Lerato particularly are posing to us. So I want us just to check in, Mikey, our co-moderator, is there anything that's emerging that you would like us to bring?
Thank you so much, Peter. We do have a question that has been placed in the chat, and we are encouraging our attendees to please use the Q&A box to pose any question. You can direct your question to a particular panelist, or in fact, it could also be a general question. We will be sure to decide at that point to whom that question may be directed. However, before I take one question, Peter, we will pause and spend just a very brief moment in prayer. Let us pray. Compassionate and merciful God, you hear the cries of your people, the cries of your people from this generation and generations past. A cry for justice, a cry, O God, in which we call upon you to intervene. We are often weary in our cries to you, because as we cry out, we observe that injustice seems to continue unabated. In our weariness, may we find strength in you, as those who have served you in the past have found their strength in you. We know you to be the God of history, the God who has always journeyed with your people and who today continues that journey. We ask, O God, that as you intervene in the affairs of human history, that you will do so in the same way you did on that first Advent, when you became flesh and dwelt among us. May you once again become incarnate through those who work and seek and pray for justice, so that in all that we do, through our doing, through our praying, indeed, the prayer which Jesus taught us will be answered. your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. We have received one question, and let me go straight to that question, Peter. From Katilo Mokiana. Here is the question, and it's actually for you, Lerato. It says, do you think South Africa needs another TRC? And if so, well, and you did say that, so I guess they're asking you, if so, how should it be different from the one in the mid-90s, especially with the post-1994 context? I think you would have hit at that a little bit, but they're asking you to expand on that in terms of how do you think a new South African TRC would look in light of the current realities on the ground in South Africa? And while you think about that, we are inviting Samu to you. We see that you've raised your hand. However, we're asking you to write that question in the Q&A chat, and to any of our other attendees, please also use the Q&A. Thank you so much. So over to you, Lerato.
Thank you so much. I think I've already touched a bit on this question, but as I touched on it, I forgot something that actually to mention that in 2014 or it was 2012, 2014, it was the commemoration of the TRC. And I remember Desmond Tutu himself mentioned that in South Africa, we needed a process that will, for example, he proposed that there should be wealth tax. And I remember the reaction within the white community against this. It was very bad, it was not good. He cannot talk about wealth tax. And so then you just find out that Desmond Tutu sound good if they're speaking about forgiveness and reconciliation, but when they speak about justice, no one wants to hear that. So my proposal of the second TRC will be that the first TRC dealt with, I mean, it was really if you go through the TRC of South Africa, it was a declaration of Black people saying to white South African, we will not be vengeful. We will not seek justice by violence. We are willing to work together for this community. That is precisely what it was, because they put themselves at the altar to say, we will not do what you are thinking that we will do. So even the theme of the TRC, if you remember Nelson Mandela and de Klerk, the National Party wanted reconciliation to form part of the Truth Commission, and the ANC didn't want its people who were in the liberation movement to be prosecuted for fighting for justice, because they understood that it was a justice cause that they were fighting for. So therefore, the negotiations came with the preamble that actually set up the TRC, the need for not vengeance, but a time for Ubuntu. So that's why I'm saying that it was the declaration for Black people to say, let's talk, let's listen. And I think what you are seeing now in the context of South Africa, what's happening on the ground is the impatience. The people have run out of patience. And I must say to Prof, he just spoke now from Germany. What I always admire about reading this German context is that even here, I spent some time with a German professor, was the re-looking into the past and asking questions about past, and also actually taking an initiative to take responsibility about what happened in the past, because I mean, she was here even writing about the story of her own family, and she was talking about how it's hard to even make sense of that, to know that your immediate family was involved in such things. And now in South Africa, what we do not have is that kind of reflection of the past. So the truth, in fact, is even debatable in South Africa. So we don't even agree on the truth. So it becomes very difficult to even speak of such issues. That's why I'm saying, if we would have a truth commission, that a second one, it must perhaps be the perpetrators or beneficiaries of apartheid, those who have been privileged by that system, that are declaring that actually, let's sit down, let's talk. This is what we are willing to do, because Black people were willing to say, we are putting up down arms. We are not, and it's been 30 years now. So last year, I mean, if you saw people, politicians will be like, it was about corruption and Jacob Zuma only. But we never think that the poor also have the mind to take advantage of the situation. People didn't have food, and COVID also impacted on them. Literally, grandmothers were going to shops to take food. And I don't think there's a human being who would want to be seen on TV doing that. There's no dignity in that. It means that these are really cries from the ground. It's a real experience. It's something that needs to be done in South Africa before things get out of hand.
Thank you, Lerato, for such a response to this question. I'm just going to step in, and I think we might have a useful moment here. Mikey, can you mute? Because I'm hearing myself twice. Thank you. Friends will know this, but Mikey and I are in the same office, so we hear each other twice, which is terrible. Hearing myself once is bad enough. Sorry, I think we might move to the video input from Dr. Catherine Namakula. She's the chairperson of the UN's working group of experts on people of African descent. I think this might also bring us into some of these other areas, building on Professor Kobe's comment, and then I'll bring us back to one or two of these other remaining questions around whiteness and the role of religious identity, faith, and spirituality. So,
distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I bring you warm greetings from the working group of experts on people of African descent, and convey our special gratitude to the World Council of Churches for continually collaborating with the working group in such a fruitful manner. And we also want to thank you for centering reparations in your work. 21 years ago, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action urged states to adopt the necessary measures to ensure the right of victims to seek just and adequate reparation, to redress acts of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. The working group has consequently affirmed that reparations are essential to remedying the legacies of the tragedies of the past. I'll begin by describing what reparations are. They are making amends for a past wrong. They are a process as much as an outcome. Reparations take different forms, but the shared vision is truth, justice, and reconciliation. Ascertaining the truth about what happened, according justice to the victims, and reconciling the victims with the perpetrators. Of significant focus today, as I discuss the interface between reparations and reconciliation, is the agreement reached by the Federal Republic of Germany and the government of Namibia in the previous year. There was a joint declaration where Germany acknowledged the genocide, the gross human rights violations, and human sufferings that characterized the colonial period and specifically affected the Nama and Herero people. The suppression of the Nama and Herero people resulted in the killing of a significant portion of their population. People were enslaved, they were forced into displacement, and they were dispossessed of their property and land. In the joint agreement last year, Germany apologized and committed an amount of just over 1 billion euro to facilitate a reconstruction and development support program in favor of the affected communities. The joint declaration was preceded by several suits by the Nama and Herero people against Germany in US courts. And it is important to note that these claims did not succeed. They were actually dismissed. This particular agreement is contentious for many reasons, including the lack of commitment to reparation properly so-called by Germany, but at the same time coupled with advancement of some form of reparations to preempt reparation itself. The agreement stipulates that the payment made was a settlement of all the financial aspects of the issues between Germany and Namibia. Secondly, is exclusion of descendants of victims of the genocide, who are specifically the Nama and Herero, from the talks. Germany focused on the state structure by engaging the contemporary state of Namibia, but the geographical specifications of the areas affected by the genocides in the agreement are the Nama and Herero. Germany avoided saying that these were reparations for the genocide, but advanced an offer for a program that addressed what happened in the areas that were occupied by the Nama and Herero. So if there was any attempt to conceal this is one point that reveals that that attempt was not successful. In short, the agreement was about the Nama and Herero and their situation, but it did not include them. They were not invited to form the table. They formed the subject for the talks, but they were not part of those talks. Despite their willingness to get involved, despite them coming forward and actually advancing a claim in court and saying, we are here, we are seeking this, and that claim led to an agreement, they were not included. This undermined the potential of this agreement to reconcile Germany with the actual victims. And because of that, their demand remains valid and it's still on the table despite the agreement. Because as we said, procedural integrity guarantees the legitimacy of the outcome when it comes to reparations. Ladies and gentlemen, it is interesting to know that this approach is not actually unprecedented. The course taken by Germany in the joint declaration with Namibia is similar to the defense tendered by the Netherlands in response to a civil suit that was filed by the surviving relatives of the victims of the Rawagede massacre in 2008. The Dutch state acknowledged the wrongfulness of the summary executions, expressed regret, and declared an allocation of 850,000 euro in development aid to the village of Rawagede. The key question we have to address is whether articulations of regret and donation of development aid can be considered as specific expressions of an effective remedy. This approach was rejected by a court, especially in relation to the surviving widows of the victims. The court held the state liable for damages to the widows. The Rawagede case sets a precedent that reparations are distinct in both form and effect. Whereas reparations are remedial, they address a legacy of the past and create a legal entitlement. Development aid is prospective and often imposes reporting obligations on the beneficiaries. It replicates a colonial power dynamic that often favors the perpetuator. This is why it is unethical for it to be compared to reparations at all. A reparations framework, whether resulting from a political negotiation or a court process, must represent the desires of the victims and stipulate the time frame within which the sums are to be paid. Reparations must be proportional, appropriate, prompt, and adequate. They must guarantee the right of the victims to participate, because the participation of victims guarantees their reconciliation with their perpetrator. There can be no reparations without reconciliation. The legitimacy of the negotiations between Germany and Namibia and the outcome without the involvement of the victims and their descendants is highly questionable. It is highly questionable. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention, and I wish you a fruitful session going further. I thank you.
I want to pick up a theme from Dr. Namakula's presentation, which I think connects back to things, Martha, you were sharing, and a question that's come up in our Q&A from Samukuli CUA, that we have to ensure whatever these truth and reconciliation processes are, they do not become re-victimizing processes, and that they're not used as a means to continue to, steal the voices of and silence the people who are in the heart of this struggle and who represent the way forward for reconciliation through reparation. And I think these have been key pieces in the things we've heard. I want, at the same time within that, and to come back to you, Professor Kobe, for a few moments, whilst we are acknowledging these the discrete, specific contexts that need to govern how reparation takes place, how reconciliation conversations take place, in nearly all of our conversations and in nearly all of the spaces where these conversations are situated, there's the overarching presence of whiteness. And this overarching presence is something all of us have to navigate and confront. So I'm curious, just for a few moments, we are running out of time, but perhaps, Professor Kobe, you might just briefly comment then on how you think whiteness can be addressed and by whom.
Thank you for this question, which is a very broad one. I'm thinking now, when the doc was talking just before, that interestingly in the South African Commission, and I'm thinking for my students to not mention this, it will be a crime, because Church of South Africa is celebrated for having such a representation of women, not just the commissioners, but the victims. But currently in my own research work, I've published some articles on this. The women experiences and suffering didn't form part of the TRC. They were present, but they were not present. So they were present for others to make the story of reconciliation presentable. So therefore, Black women within that context were used to perform pain and suffering so that we can have the new South Africa. So, and that is important now when we are talking about a whiteness, because one of the things that we have tried to do within the church in South Africa, we had the International Justice Conference that was happening. I don't know whether now they have stopped it, but I spoke there several times. I think they hosted it 2 times or 3 times. All those times I was there. And we said that we did not want, as much as we love that they are taking, white people are taking on this reflection, but we do not want them directing the conversation. And therefore, we had all speakers that usually it was Australia, America, North America, and South Africa. We had all these speakers, and we had Black women to speak also. But the interesting part of that is that white South Africans could direct the conversation from the pew. While the speaker is on stages, we think that our president will direct the conversation, but the conversation went the way, you know, to such an extent that then the younger generation again asked the question, okay, and I know as theologians, you'll say this is blasphemous or something. But the new generation says that in systematic theology, all that we have been taught about God, the attributes of God, that God is omnipresent, is omniscience, we have found out that these things are all whiteness is. Even when we are Black people together, the presence of whiteness is still there. So I just that's why I'm saying it's so broad, because you have to look at it in very multifaceted ways to see it. And I had friends who came from Uganda, Nigeria, and South Africa, and they will say, South Africans are so obsessed with the race. Then after a year, you have a conversation with them, and they change their perspective, and they're saying, even now, when I'm going home to Uganda or Nigeria, I can see now these things that are present, but not really present. So it's a very broad, I mean, that will need all of us. How do we think through this? How do we try to do justice work, reparation, being aware of these things coming together? And I think in South Africa, I don't know if you know Steve Biko, a right watcher, like dealt with also this particular question. We always say in South Africa, he's an ancestor who refused to sleep.
Thank you so much. I'm reminded of a quotation whose quotation I'm not sure, but a friend of mine, Professor Anthony Reddy, said to me, to understand that whiteness is not, the meanest shark. It is the sea that we all have to swim in. And so, Martha, I'd like to come to you, and maybe that you will also want to comment on whiteness in this, but I want also to press us into another area that you had also indicated as a necessary part of the reparatory action that's required. So religious identity, religious thinking and spirituality are really on both sides of this, both as perpetrator, especially as you've defined it, but also as the means of remediation and release. So I wonder if there's something you might like to comment, either, reclaiming Indigenous spiritualities in this context as a reparatory piece, or anything in relation to whiteness as well, of course. But perhaps, Martha, you might just begin to share a few thoughts here.
Okay, yes, thank you. I just like to mention about the whiteness from the context of my work in Indigenous ministries. I think for the church to be intentionally aware of the colonizing and oppressive pedagogy in policy, and to work at deconstructing socialized white authority and enactments of white privilege within the church would be a recognizable, actionable step in dismantling systems that harm Indigenous people. So in an attempt to change this ideology, Indigenous Ministries put forth a proposal that proposed that the 44th General Council of the United Church act on the issue of autonomy of the Indigenous Church by identifying and removing all of the structural barriers to developing and sustaining an autonomous Indigenous church within the United Church of Canada. And this is consistent with the caretakers' calls to the church and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This would continue the conversation of restructuring and right relations and reparations with the National Indigenous Circle. This also calls for them to report back to General Council 45 on the state of this dialogue that's happening and also the required next steps. So the proposal was accepted by General Council this year, and it's determined the United Church's willingness to move towards reconciliation, reparation, inclusiveness, and a shifting culture through systemic changes. So that's all I want to say on that part about whiteness, how that affects Indigenous church and communities. But on the role of religion and spirituality, the Indigenous Ministries of the United Church of Canada have been about the work of ministry since the beginning of contact with missionaries. So 2022 marks the 197th anniversary of the Methodist Mission in Southern Ontario, Canada. This long history has seen bright beginnings and dark days, and with the announcement of the finding of the first 215 children, it has at times been hard to be part of the church. Indigenous people have met regularly over many decades and held deep and ongoing conversations about matters that relate to our Indigenous work and our relationship with the United Church. And we've been evolving, struggling, adapting, and growing since that time, and even losing ground. But we do not want to lose gains that we've achieved through the years in the future developments of the church, Indigenous church specifically. So in the document entitled Calls to the Church, which was developed in 2017 by the caretakers of our Indigenous Circle, which was Indigenous led, it was written that Indigenous ministries and communities of faith of the United Church declare that we will tell our own story of what ministry means for us, and we will determine an Indigenous testamer, which is a training program for ministry preparation that will help our leaders be competent as the healers and helpers our communities are crying out for. We will recruit and oversee the development of our ministry training students and assist their placement and support in our Indigenous communities using a parallel process. So meaning that the key aspect in regards to Indigenous identity and spirituality, that we will facilitate the inclusion of both Western and traditional theological identity as the whole church, within the whole church. And our roots as Indigenous peoples are what the Creator has made us to be. And through this parallel path, we are embracing who we are as Creator made us. So thank you.
Thank you, Martha, so much for this important testimony and wisdom for us. I want to move to our concluding remarks then, friends. Our time has run away, as you can imagine. But this is the beginning of further work we are committed to in so many ways, you individually, ourselves corporately at the World Council of Churches. And it's into that last little piece I want us to move. Just for two brief sentences, please, friends. And I will come, first of all, Reverend Dr. Reiser, to you, all your experience in the ecumenical movement. What then, friends, shall we say, are the implications of restorative justice for the ecumenical movement today? Just a couple of sentences as we conclude and complete. So, Conrad, perhaps you'd like to share.
What I would like to, after this conversation, what I would like to underline in particular is the need to continue struggling with the truth. Because truth is manifold and on different layers. And there is not one approach, but it comes back, it's a circular approach. And the more you dig, the more you reveal about facets of the truth that have not been acknowledged yet. And therefore, if acknowledging the truth is part of the process of restoring justice, then I think we never stop trying to come to bring the full truth to our awareness. And this ultimately is a very profound spiritual challenge, because the full truth will be revealed to us in the eyes of God as we place ourselves before the eyes of our heavenly judge and our heavenly Savior. And I think it is this prayerful approach to the concern for understanding and facing up, being able to face up to the full truth, that is a facet that has accompanied my own concern about the German situation all through these past decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reisa. Professor Kobe, then, what, as you think about this wider movement that WCC is part of, are there things you would put as challenges before us or highlight to us, making restorative justice a key facet in the ecumenical movement?
Thank you again. And I think I would perhaps we should start taking seriously the works of Desmond Tutu and not reading him to put him in our own understanding, but actually dealing with what he was really saying, because you find so much thesis on him, and really you get to understand people don't understand his work. And therefore, for me, if we can also be able, because also he has this strength of the interdialogue between African spirituality and Christianity. For example, in my work, I have said I'm not going to focus on Ubuntu post-1994 because it is so distorted. It means forgiveness. But it doesn't mean that it's such a nuanced phenomenon. It speaks about justice. It's so many things. And I think Desmond Tutu tried to say this, but the world was not listening. So therefore, if we can be able to if our Christian faith, Christian theology can actually learn to listen to other spiritualities, how these issues have been dealt with, I think even the indigenous people in the world will feel part of the conversation, because for me, that's where I'm strong at. In my work, I always speak from the perspective of being an African, but also of being raised as within Abantu spirituality. Then there is the church, because within the global south, there's always these two spiritualities existing side by side, and we see this in the work of Desmond Tutu. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kobe. Martha Pedoniquotte, you had already, I think, in the comments you were outlining as to what this kind of spirituality of repentance, reparation could look like. Could you say a little more then for a movement that brings together then, as you know well, perpetrator and challenger to those systems, how this movement could further embody restorative justice?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. So, as Indigenous people, we've seen that the implications of restorative justice through the utilization of a commission for truth and reconciliation doesn't always achieve the desired result if there is no concrete plan to implement the outcomes or to take responsibility by all stakeholders, the church and the state. So we need a vision of justice that heals and restores, where responsibility is admitted, where remorse is indicated, and where there is a willingness to address the harm caused. Indigenous people have been using restorative justice as a means to right the harms and as an alternative way to change behavior in a more truthful and transformative way. it was used for years, the circle process where the victim and the perpetrator were face to face to discuss things. And this challenge is to see that it can be used in a broader form that focuses on the harm done to communities, to nations, and to races of people as opposed to individuality. So one that will ensure designated accountable outcomes. And I think that it could be a useful tool. Thank you.
Friends, we are at an end, basically. I want to share a brief thought and then invite Mikey to comment and conclude for us, having been part of all of these conversations and from his own particular perspective and gift to share. We are asking a movement. We're asking for repentance. We are asking for change and transformation. We are asking for a lifelong commitment to each other in a fellowship of liberation. Who can we ask to do this if we cannot ask the church? This is the discipleship that transforms everything. If we can take that, those steps, together, let's say, with that spirituality that we say we have. This is the challenge, to continue to embody that and enlarge that space of understanding the wisdom and spirituality that the Creator uses and calls, and the movements that liberate and transform and free. So friends, I'm deeply grateful for the ways you have shared and how you have shared, and thank you for that part in our conversation today. And then to you, Mikey, for any concluding thought or comment or reflection you might wish to conclude us with.
Thank you so much, Peter. As I, in fact, Segma, I think we're going to come back to you for the final word. But what I want to do in just the last minute is actually draw us back to the comments, because I think it's always good to honor those who have taken the time to come and to write. And as I draw your attention to these comments, I want to let the persons who wrote the comments and the question know that, in fact, the questions and the comments have been answered, even without me bringing attention to them. So that's good. Jermaine asked, what is the most important divergence between a United Nations / human rights centered approach to reparations and to justice and to reconciliation, and of the range of responses demanded by Christian theologies in the broadest sense of the Christian traditions? And I think we certainly were able to pull those together in terms of how an Indigenous spirituality or even an Ubuntu spirituality can indeed speak to helping us to reframe some of these broad issues. Samuke Lee Siwe, finally, we saw your question. Thank you. How do we encourage a conversation that can restore the brokenness of the victims of human rights violation by the apartheid government, and how the Second Truth Commission translate into deliverables? And I think, Lerato, you certainly mentioned that in terms of some transferables and some deliverables. And Martha also pointed us to some deliverables that are happening on the ground there. And I think Conrad also made reference to, in fact, the German situation has provided some deliverables. So those are two that I want to highlight while I recognize the others in the comments. And my closing thought, Peter, as one who have sat with these webinars, as I hand things over to Segma, is, and I don't want to be, the devil's advocate at this point as we wrap things up, but Conrad, I am amazed how the Germans have been able to make the world feel the weight of the Holocaust. And my advice is how, going back to Peter's question of whiteness, if whether in South Africa or in Quebec, how we in the rest of the world could take a page from how whiteness operated, and how, in fact, even as a Black man from the Caribbean, I am still made to feel the weight of the Holocaust. And how then, what did they do? And how did they use the world and the cases? And I think somehow, if we are to really be impactful, then we need to all look and see what the Germans did, and maybe we're not all white, but we can certainly learn how to play that white game to ensure that our issues as well, as people of African descent, as the indigenous community, also make sure that issues of reparations do in fact occupy center stage in the global psyche. Thank you. Segma, over to you.
Thank you, Mikey. I would like to say thank you once again to our panelists for this very rich conversation, which was very moving on so many levels, very rich, very insightful. And I would also like to thank our moderator and co-facilitator, as well as Marcelo, who in the background is making sure all goes well. This conversation have shown us that all regions have wounds from the past, unspoken wounds, forgotten wounds, and other forms of wounds. And as churches, this pilgrimage of justice and reconciliation on which we have embarked is very critical, because we are agents of healing. We have a vocations of being agents of healing and reconciliation. The process of truth telling, the process of healing and reconciliation is hard. It is painful, but it's about being acknowledged. It's about being heard. It's about being put on the map again. It's about not being erased. And as Sister Kobe said earlier, even in the TRC, women were not at the table. We need to redesign those tables to make sure that the victims are sitting there. They are acknowledged, they are honored, their memory as well. And this is just the beginning of a process. Because of the pilgrimage, we have another 8 years again to work deeply on this, and hoping to learn from the work that was done under your leadership during your leadership of the ecumenical movement, Professor Konrad Reiser. And again, I would say healing of memories is a vocation of churches. We cannot stress that enough. And because as Christians, we are called to be disciples of healing. So with these very brief remarks, I would like to conclude this webinar and say thank you to each one of you for your time, your commitment. 90 minutes does not do justice to this discussion. But again, as always, these webinars are a teaser, and we hope that more conversation will come out of these. I wish you all a blessed Advent season, and I hope we will stay in touch on this important question. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.